Welcome to Ruby Thursday. I'm Melissa Wanish. In this Ruby Snack, we'll be continuing our series on nested forms. This week, we'll create a parent object on a child form. If you'd like to code along, you'll just need to have a Rails app created, our Spec installed and set up, and I'm also using simple BDD in my specs today. And you'll need a parent and child models created. You can check out these other videos, Ruby Snack number 5, where we put in the nested forms. We have a Starship parent model and a crew member child model. You can also check out Ruby Snack number 9, that's the second in the series, but you don't necessarily have to have that set up for this episode. We have a new request from Starfleet Command. We are now to provide a new crew member form where a visitor can create a crew member and assign him or her to a starship or create a new starship from the same form. So this time it's the child form that's first, and we'll create the parent from that form. Jumping right into our spec, we're going to create a new feature called New Crew Member. And I have 2 scenarios written with simple BDD. In the first scenario, the visitor assigns new crew member to a starship that's already existing. Given visitor views new crew member form, when visitor enters crew member info assigning to existing starship, then visitor views the updated starship. In the second scenario, we'll add that parent. So visitor creates new crew member and starship. Visitor views new crew member form. Visitor enters crew member and new starship info, and visitor views the new starship. Next, we'll set up a factory to set up a starship that we can use for this first scenario. Next, we'll define visitor views new crew member form. We'll simply visit the starship's path and add a link where they can create a new crew member. And we'll expect that page to have new crew member text. Next, we'll define visitor enters crew member info assigning to existing starship. So we'll fill in the crew member name. You may not remember, but Reginald Barclay was in a couple of episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, and I thought he was a great character because he had some neuroses, and it was fun to watch him play those out. Then we'll, of course, assign him to engineering. Select Enterprise from the crew member Starship ID. That will be a drop-down so the visitor can select the starship, and we'll click the button to create new member. Continuing on, we will define visitor views updated starship. So we will expect the page to have that content, Reginald Barclay. Now for our second scenario, we need to define visitor views new starship. We'll expect the page to have the content Reginald Barclay and to have the content of Voyager, the new starship. He was also on that series. Finally, we'll define the visitor enters crew member and new starship info. So we'll fill in crew member name with Reginald Barclay, engineering. This time, we're going to fill in the starship attribute name with Voyager. And of course, click the button to create new crew member. Phew, that seems like a long spec, but it's actually not too hard to implement. Moving right into our text editor, let's make that new file. So that's spec, features, new file. And we'll go ahead and save that and name it new crew member spec.rb. And of course, we'll now include that lovely spec that I talked all the way through and save that. Let's go ahead and fix up our Starship Factory to be a little bit more fun. So we're going to change that name to be Enterprise. We'll go into Factories, then Starship, and just change my string to be Enterprise. And that's it. Now that we have the feature spec and factory all set up, let's run that spec in our terminal and see where to start. The first time I ran this, I was missing an ending parentheses, so hopefully it works this time. And yes, okay, now we have a fail. So let's scroll up and see what we need to do first. We don't have a link to create a new crew member. We'll add that to our index of starships. We'll simply create the link to create new crew member, going to new crew member path. Next, we'll add that path to our routes. We're only going to add resources for new and create because that's all they've asked us for. We're not going to open up all of CRUD just yet. Moving back to our text editor, let's go to App, Views, Starships, and then the index. And just at the bottom, we'll add that link to create a new crew member. Next, we will go into Config, Routes. We'll add the crew member resources just after Starships. Now we need to define those routes and actions in our crew member controller. So we'll create a new file and define new with crew member new. And this time we're going to build a starship from the crew member. So it's at crewmember.build starship. Then of course we need to create the crew member. So we'll have the crew member params. Then after crew member is saved, we're going to set the starship as the crewmember.starship so that we can redirect to the appropriate starship. The rest is pretty standard for your create action. Moving down our controller, we're going to define the private method crewmember params. We're going to require crewmember and permit name, division, starship ID, and then the starship attributes, name and ID. These are the attributes we need to whitelist so that the starship is created, connecting it to the crew member. Back in our text editor, we'll go to controllers and create that new file. And we'll go ahead and save it as crew members controller.rb and include our controller code. Now we need to make sure that the crew member will accept the nested attributes for Starship. So we'll go into the crew member model and add the line accepts nested attributes for Starship. Now notice that it's one singular starship, not starships, because crew member belongs to just one starship. And we are going to reject if that attribute name is blank, so we don't create blank starships, because the form does allow you to select an already existing starship. Let's go to our models and then crew member, and then add in those lines to accept the nested attributes for. Next, we'll go ahead and deal with a little bit of our views. We'll go ahead and add the new view for crew members. It'll simply render the form and have the text new crew member. We actually need to create a new folder for the views for crew members. So we'll create crew members and then add a new file to that folder. And we'll go ahead and save that as new.html.erb. Then we put in those 3 lines to make the standard new view. We haven't run our spec in a bit, so it's time to do so and see our progress. We've added a lot. Okay, failing, but let's check out, good, a new error that it cannot find the crew member field. That's because we haven't added the form yet. Now we come to the crew member form. The first part is pretty standard. It has the errors and then the fields for the crew member, the name, and the division. Next comes the fun part of adding a starship. We'll have a collection select, which will include all of the starships that have been created. So we're going to put that under Starship ID, which is an attribute for crew member. Then it'll gather all the starships. It'll have the Starship ID when we create. It will show the name and also having a prompt to select starship. Next, we will allow the visitor to create a new starship. And now we'll have our nested form. And it's nested because we have the f.fields for starship do. We'll just have the identifier as starship. So then we'll have starship.label name and then starship.text field name, so they can include the name. And finally, we wrap up with our submit button, create crew member. Let's put this bad boy in. We'll create a new file in the crew members folder and save it as _form for a partial.html.erb. And now we include the form and save it. Now we'll run the spec again to see if we've missed anything and if we now have passing specs. And we do 2 examples, 0 failures. That wraps up this episode of Ruby Snacks and our 3rd installment on nested forms. If you are not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, go ahead and click that big red button right there to do so. If you have a question or comment, please do so below or on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube and are not already on my mailing list, head on over to rubythursday.com by clicking the big ol' Ruby right there to sign up to get more Ruby Thursday awesomeness in your inbox. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day and see you soon.